Well, I apologize for any of my patrons who may have been wanting this on Saturday. It's Monday, so I'm 2 days late. Hopefully, better late than never. This week's passage talked about the disciples and gave their names, mentioned Simon the Zealot. And I thought one thing I could do for the scholar portion of this week is talk briefly about the Zealots. Well, here is the first mention of the Zealots in Josephus's work. So Josephus has several works. The three that first come to mind are the Jewish War, which he probably wrote fairly early on and not long after the Jewish War. And so Josephus's Jewish War is in 7 books, I believe, is generally considered probably the more accurate portrayal. When he writes, and of course he was, there is a dimension in which he was under the thumb of the Romans, I suppose actually he was under the patronage of the Romans when he wrote the Jewish War. And so there is probably a little bit of flattery when it comes to the Romans. Maybe we can't be quite, we have to take Josephus with a grain of salt. He's not as scrupulous as Thucydides in my mind. Josephus is a propagandist. And so you have to learn how to read between the propaganda. He also, I think, is a bit of a message version in some respects. The way he portrays the Pharisees, for example, the Essenes, the Sadducees, he's presenting these Jewish groups to a non-Jewish audience. At least it feels that way. Maybe he brings out, or let me say, he brings out Hellenistic categories in the way that he presents the story. Of course, there's also the against Appian and the Antiquities, which in the Antiquities he sweeps all of Jewish history. Well, so this is the first place in his writings where he mentions the Zealots. Ananus, the high priest, this he's talking about during the Jewish War, 66 to 72. Ananus's concern was this: to lay aside for a while the preparations for the war with the Romans, and to persuade the seditious to consult their own interest, and to restrain the madness of those that had the name of zealots. But their violence was too hard for him, and what end he came to we shall relate hereafter. And so this is the way it often is. Those who want they have the same goal maybe, but the zealots get in the way. The zealots ruin it. This is just life, where those who want, those who say, okay, I have the goal, you do, but let's do this prudently. Let's get there. Let's actually get there, where the zealots then, go crazy and ruin the whole thing. I just saw Avengers Infinity War this past weekend. And there's this one scene where they almost have the gauntlet off of Thanos. And that's, if they could just get the gauntlet off, he's toast. But there's one guy, what does he call himself? Quill is his name. I'm blanking on his name. He can't hold himself. He's got to pointlessly beat Thanos. And of course, Thanos wakes up, he gets the gauntlet, and everybody dies. Star-Lord. Anyway, so this is the way it always is. There's truth, and I think we can actually take Josephus at his word here. I don't think there's any politicking or propagandizing in this paragraph. But notice that the group called the Zealots appears here. It doesn't appear so much so in the earlier part of the history of Israel. Of course, the Jewish War isn't about all of Israel's history. But hold that thought, that Josephus, when he really talks about the Zealots, he talks about them during the Jewish War. Well, in the Antiquities, so this is from Antiquities 18, his famous passage where he describes the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes. This is probably not quite right. It's been written a bit later, probably maybe a little bit after maybe the time of Acts. But here's what he says. But of the fourth sect of Jewish philosophy, Judas the Galilean was the author. Now, Judas the Galilean led a revolt around 6 AD, about the time that Cyrenius was governor of Syria. Now, of course, that's another, I'm not doing Luke, but the only time that we know of Cyrenius being governor of Syria was in AD 6. Some have suggested that maybe he had also been governor of Syria in 6 BC. We have no record of who was governor at that time. But anyway, Judas the Galilean seems to have been a revolutionary or a brigand or a traitor or a Messiah wannabe about AD 6. But, you know, the thing is, Judas didn't start a school. He didn't start a philosophy. That's not the way revolutionaries work. Revolutionaries are angry. They go and burn things. Now, I know that there have been some, you know, the IRA that managed to go the distance for a little bit longer. But there was no organized kind of underground fourth philosophy. No, you had revolutionary movements that cropped up from time to time here and there, and then the Romans snuffed them out, and Judas the Galilean was snuffed out. But basically, so what Josephus has done here is he's taken different revolutionary moments in history, independent groups of yeah, let's storm the castle, you know, and then they get killed. But this is not a philosophy. But revolutionaries do agree with the Pharisaic notions. He's making this up. They have inviolable attachment to liberty. Yes, that's true. They say that God is to be their only ruler and Lord. Maybe they say that. Or maybe they just say, kill some Romans. They also don't value dying any kinds of death. That's because they're not in control of themselves usually. Nor indeed do they heed the deaths of their relations and friends. Nor can any such fear make them call any man Lord. And since this immovable resolution of theirs is well known to a great many, I shall speak no farther about that matter, nor am I afraid that anything I've said of them should be disbelieved, but rather fear that what I've said is beneath the resolution they show when they undergo pain. And it was in Gessius Florus's time that the nation began to grow mad with this distemper, who was our procurator, and who occasioned the Jews to go wild with it by the abuse of his authority to make them revolt from the Romans. Okay, so again, when he really gets down to it, when were these revolutionaries active? It was during the time of the Jewish War. And so Craig Keener here sums it up well. Since I'm doing this somewhat quickly, let me just read what the incredibly learned scholar Craig Keener of Asbury Seminary has to say in his 4 massive volumes on Acts. The evidence seems to tell against a unified revolutionary movement in first century Palestine. The term zealots applies strictly only to some rather than to most early Jewish revolutionaries. Josephus seems to reserve the title for a limited group. Indeed, Josephus employs the title primarily in his Jewish War, and apart from the passage I just read you, he does not employ the title in this sense until War Book 4, where he's treating the war itself. This is the majority opinion. Martin Hengel wrote a book called The Zealots, Die Zeloten, the Zealots, in which he takes a different position. But to me, this makes perfect sense. And in an earlier video, I think I mentioned that around the time of the Iraq War, there was this attempt to link all anti-American Muslim jihadist groups as if they were part of some unified philosophical system, you know, that they're hiding behind trees, and they're all under one unified, you know, Darth Vader somewhere. When in fact these were just independent groups with common goals and common themes and common motifs and common feelings and common personalities, but they weren't in any way conspiring with each other. Of course, I think as time went by, the war in Iraq kind of unified them and did make them become a little bit more connected, perhaps. But when we were thinking about going to war, there was a lot of rhetoric that kind of lumped them all together. And so if we have Muslim enemies in Afghanistan, they're the same as our enemies in Iraq, you know, which was not true. That's just not. Anyway, I won't get off into that. I will simply say that the Zealots probably weren't an organized group until the time of the Jewish War, which makes it all the more striking that the book of Acts and the book of Matthew, or not the book of Matthew, Mark and Acts, call Simon the Zealot, because they were both written after this time. And so to call him a zealot seems very striking to me. I wonder if he fought in the Jewish war. Well, I can't prove it, but this has been a few scholarly thoughts by Ken the Shank.